The sound of polished wood meeting wood echoed through the barracks, followed by the distant crash of pins falling. Takeshi Yamamoto bolted upright on his cot, heart pounding against his ribs. After months in the jungles of Guadalcanal, every sudden noise still triggered combat reflexes. But this sound, it wasn't artillery or gunfire. It was rhythmic, almost recreational. He exchanged confused glances with the other Japanese prisoners who shared his quarters at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. "What is that noise?" he whispered to Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, who had been captured 2 weeks before him. "The Americans," Tanaka replied, his voice low. "They have this game, with large balls and wooden pins." For weeks, the prisoners had heard these strange sounds from a building near the center of the camp. They had been told it was a recreation hall, but the concept seemed alien. Recreation? In a prison camp? The Imperial Japanese Army had drilled into them that capture meant torture, starvation, and likely execution. They had been prepared to die rather than surrender, indoctrinated to believe that Americans would treat them as less than human. Yet here they were, in a camp with heated barracks, 3 meals a day, and medical attention. And now, these puzzling sounds of what seemed to be play? Could it be some elaborate psychological trick? A way to lull them into complacency before the real cruelty began? Takeshi couldn't make sense of it, but he was certain of one thing. Nothing in his military training had prepared him for the bewildering reality of American captivity. As the evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, Takeshi made a silent vow to understand what was happening beyond the walls of their barracks. What strange ritual were these Americans engaged in, and why did it sound so at odds with everything he had been taught to expect? The question lingered in his mind as the distant sounds continued, each crash of falling pins echoing like the collapse of everything he thought he knew about his captors. The next morning dawned crisp and cold, the Wisconsin winter seeping through even the well-insulated barracks. Takeshi and 20 other Japanese prisoners were assigned to maintenance duty around the camp, clearing paths of snow and ice under the watchful but surprisingly relaxed gaze of American guards. As they worked, Takeshi could not help but notice the difference between these men and the monsters described in Japanese propaganda. The guards spoke casually among themselves, sometimes even joking with prisoners who understood basic English. Lieutenant Davidson, a young officer from Iowa who oversaw their work detail, approached with an unusual request. "We need help moving equipment in the rec hall," he said through an interpreter. "Any volunteers?" Suspicious glances were exchanged among the prisoners. Volunteering for anything in a prison camp seemed dangerous, but curiosity overcame caution for Takeshi and 5 others who raised their hands. Davidson led them toward the mysterious building from which those strange sounds emanated each evening. As the doors swung open, Takeshi froze in the entrance, eyes widening at the sight before him. 6 polished wooden lanes stretched the length of the building, each ending in a triangular arrangement of pins. American soldiers in casual uniform shirts were rolling heavy balls down these lanes, shouting in excitement when the pins toppled. The atmosphere was boisterous, relaxed, entirely unlike the somber efficiency Takeshi had expected from enemy soldiers. "We're setting up new pins and need to move these ball racks," Davidson explained through the translator, pointing to heavy wooden structures at the end of each lane. While they worked, Takeshi could not take his eyes off the activity around them. Men who had presumably killed his countrymen in battle were now engaged in this frivolous game, laughing and slapping each other on the back. One soldier even demonstrated the proper technique, miming the swing and release of the ball to an amused audience of his peers. "What is this called?" Takeshi finally asked the interpreter. "Bowling," came the reply. "It's a popular American pastime." Pastime. The word itself seemed foreign. In the Imperial Army, every moment was devoted to duty, training, and sacrifice. The concept of structured play for grown men, especially soldiers in wartime, was almost incomprehensible. Yet here it was, not hidden away, but prominently featured in the center of a military facility. As they finished moving the equipment, Davidson did something even more unexpected. He held out a bowling ball to Takeshi. "Wanna try?" he asked through the interpreter. Takeshi stared at the ball as if it might explode. Was this some kind of test? A trap designed to humiliate him? The other prisoners watched tensely, equally confused by this breach of the expected prisoner-guard relationship. After a long moment of hesitation, Takeshi reached out and took the ball, surprised by its substantial weight. Under Davidson's guidance, he approached the lane, feeling acutely self-conscious as both American guards and fellow prisoners observed this strange cultural crossing. His first attempt was clumsy, the heavy ball veering immediately into the gutter. The Americans didn't mock him as expected. Instead, several offered encouraging nods. Davidson demonstrated again, showing how to aim straight down the center. On his second try, Takeshi knocked down 3 pins, generating a small cheer from the onlooking guards. Walking back to the barracks later, the Japanese prisoners buzzed with quiet conversation. "Why would they let us use their recreation facilities?" whispered Corporal Matsuda, a Tokyo native who had been among the first captured on Guadalcanal. Takeshi had no answer. The wooden pins falling, the smooth roll of the ball, the casual camaraderie of the guards, it all contradicted everything they had been taught to expect in captivity. And this was only the beginning of revelations that would challenge the very foundations of how these prisoners understood their enemy, their war, and ultimately themselves. That night, as Takeshi lay on his cot listening to the distant sounds of the bowling alley still in use, he wondered what other surprises awaited them in this strange land. The Americans had shown them not cruelty, but a glimpse of their everyday life. A life that included something the Imperial Army had never permitted: leisure, deliberately woven into the fabric of military discipline. Days passed, and whispers about the bowling alley spread through the camp. Those who had witnessed it firsthand became reluctant authorities, explaining the rules and purpose to disbelieving audiences. Some prisoners dismissed it as American decadence, proof of the weakness that would eventually lead to their defeat. Others were simply baffled, unable to reconcile this recreational activity with their image of the enemy. "In my village, we had no time for games," said Private Ishikawa, a farmer's son from rural Hokkaido. "From sunrise to sunset, we worked. Even children helped in the fields. These Americans play like children while fighting a war?" Sergeant Tanaka, who had spent years as a junior officer before his capture, offered a different perspective. "Perhaps it is not weakness," he said quietly. "Notice how the guards maintain discipline, even while engaging in this bowling. They rotate shifts, keep watch, follow procedures. Yet they also laugh. Is it possible that rest and recreation make their fighting forces stronger, not weaker?" The question lingered uncomfortably. Japanese military doctrine emphasized stoicism, endurance, and the suppression of personal comfort. Soldiers were expected to embrace hardship as purification. The idea that effectiveness could be enhanced by scheduled leisure seemed almost heretical. A week after his first encounter with bowling, Takeshi was surprised when Lieutenant Davidson approached him again during work detail. "We're organizing a small tournament in the rec hall," he said through the translator. "Some of the prisoners have expressed interest. Would you like to participate?" Takeshi's immediate instinct was to refuse. Participation in American recreational activities felt dangerously like collaboration. Yet curiosity tugged at him, and before he could reconsider, he found himself nodding. The tournament was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. As the appointed time approached, 14 Japanese prisoners, including Takeshi, made their way tentatively to the recreation hall. They entered to find the lanes freshly polished, score sheets prepared, and several American guards already warming up. "The rules are simple," explained Sergeant Miller, a burly man from Pennsylvania who seemed to be organizing the event. "Each player gets 2 chances per frame to knock down all 10 pins. We'll demonstrate as we go." What followed was among the most surreal experiences of Takeshi's life. Japanese prisoners of war, men who had been prepared to fight to the death rather than face the shame of capture, stood side by side with American guards, taking turns rolling heavy balls down wooden lanes. The initial awkwardness gradually gave way to a strange atmosphere of competitive focus. When Corporal Nakamura, a former fisherman from Nagasaki, bowled a strike on his third attempt, spontaneous applause broke out from both sides. Private James Wilson, a young guard barely 20 years old, leaned over to Takeshi after a particularly good frame. "You're getting the hang of it pretty quick," he said, the translator relaying his words. "Took me weeks to consistently hit the pocket like that." Takeshi nodded stiffly, uncertain how to respond to this casual friendliness. In that moment, he realized with a jolt of discomfort that he was enjoying himself. The steady rhythm of the game, the satisfying crash of pins, the simple mathematics of the scoring system, all provided a temporary escape from the reality of captivity. For a few hours, they were not prisoners and guards, but simply players in a common activity. As the tournament progressed, Takeshi observed the Americans closely. They approached bowling with a curious mixture of seriousness and levity, keeping careful score while joking about particularly bad shots. They celebrated good rolls regardless of who made them. Most surprisingly, they seemed genuinely pleased when the Japanese prisoners performed well, offering tips and demonstrations without condescension. "My father owns a bowling alley back in Chicago," explained Private Rodriguez, a dark-haired American who had been particularly helpful. "Been playing since I was tall enough to lift the ball. It's a great equalizer. Anybody can learn, anybody can get lucky, and nobody's perfect all the time." By the tournament's end, Sergeant Miller had emerged victorious, with Takeshi surprisingly placing fourth overall. As they filed out of the recreation hall, many of the Japanese prisoners found themselves subtly changed. Something had shifted in their perception of their captors and, perhaps more significantly, in their understanding of American culture itself. "They take their leisure as seriously as their work," remarked Tanaka as they returned to the barracks. "Have you noticed? They schedule it, organize it, even compete in it. Yet it doesn't seem to diminish their military effectiveness." This observation struck Takeshi forcefully. The Imperial Japanese Army had always emphasized that endurance of hardship was the path to strength. Comfort was considered weakness. Recreation was merely a distraction from duty. Yet here were the Americans, carving time for play into the heart of their military routine and still managing to push back Japanese forces across the Pacific. Could it be that everything they had been taught about American weakness was wrong? The question was too disturbing to contemplate directly, yet it lingered in the background of their thoughts, reinforced by each new experience in captivity. The bowling alley stood as a physical manifestation of this cognitive dissonance, a place where the enemy revealed themselves not as monsters, but as men who valued something the Japanese military had systematically eliminated: the balance of work and play, duty and recreation. Word of the bowling tournament spread quickly through the camp. Those who had participated found themselves besieged with questions from other prisoners. Many remained skeptical, viewing the whole affair as either a propaganda exercise or further evidence of American frivolity. Others, however, began to look at the recreation hall with new interest. "I heard they have other games as well," said Corporal Yoshida, who worked in the camp kitchen. "Cards, board games, even musical instruments." Takeshi had noticed a piano in the corner of the recreation hall, but hadn't seen anyone playing it. The idea of a military installation providing musical instruments to its personnel, much less to prisoners of war, seemed like an unimaginable luxury. Lieutenant Saito, the highest-ranking Japanese officer in their section of the camp, maintained a more traditional view. "Do not be seduced by their comforts," he warned during an informal gathering. "These games, these distractions, they are meant to soften us, to make us forget our duty to the emperor." Yet even as he spoke, Takeshi noticed the lieutenant's gaze drifting toward the recreation hall, visible through the barracks window. There was curiosity there, perhaps even a touch of wistful envy. As winter deepened in Wisconsin, the recreation hall became an increasingly central feature of camp life. American guards spent much of their free time there, especially in the evenings when the bowling lanes were busiest. More Japanese prisoners began accepting invitations to participate, despite Lieutenant Saito's warnings. Dr. Yamada, a medic who had been captured on Saipan, offered a pragmatic assessment. "The activity is beneficial," he explained to a group of hesitant prisoners. "The movement, the social interaction, these things help prevent the mind from turning inward too much. I have seen many men deteriorate in captivity from inactivity alone. His medical perspective gave permission to those who might otherwise have resisted on principle. Gradually, more Japanese prisoners found their way to the recreation hall, not just for bowling, but for chess, checkers, and other activities available there. For Takashi, the strangest aspect was not the games themselves, but the way they transformed the relationship between captives and captors. In the recreation hall, the strict hierarchy momentarily flattened. Guards and prisoners competed as individuals, their military roles temporarily set aside. It was disconcerting yet oddly liberating. In Japan, would we ever allow enemy prisoners such freedom? Takeshi asked Tanaka one evening as they watched an impromptu chess tournament. Tanaka's expression darkened. "You know the answer," he said quietly. "In our hands, American prisoners would be fortunate to receive basic necessities, let alone recreation." This uncomfortable truth hung between them. Both men had heard rumors about the treatment of Allied prisoners captured by Japanese forces, the forced labor, the starvation rations, the brutal punishment for even minor infractions. The contrast with their own experience in American captivity was stark and unsettling. One evening in late January, an unexpected snowstorm forced all outdoor work details to be canceled. With hours of unscheduled time and the biting cold making the barracks uncomfortable despite the heating system, Camp Commander Colonel Peterson made an unprecedented announcement. The recreation hall would be open all day to both guards and prisoners, with organized tournaments in bowling, chess, and cards. "It's too damn cold for anybody to be standing around outside," he declared through the interpreters. "Might as well make good use of the facilities." The Japanese prisoners exchanged glances of disbelief. An entire day devoted to recreation, endorsed by the camp commander himself? It seemed to contradict everything they understood about military discipline and the treatment of prisoners. Takeshi found himself paired with Private Wilson in a bowling doubles tournament. As they waited for their turn, Wilson chatted casually through an interpreter. "Back home in Minnesota, we bowl all winter long," he explained. "Not much else to do when the snow piles up." Every small town has at least one alley. This casual glimpse into American civilian life fascinated Takeshi. "You played this game before becoming a soldier?" he asked. Wilson laughed. "Since I was 10 years old. My whole family plays. My mother has a higher average than my father, which he'll never admit." The idea of families, including women, participating in such recreational activities together was yet another cultural shock. In Japan, leisure was largely gender-segregated, with women rarely participating in the same activities as men outside the home. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the recreation hall grew increasingly relaxed. Japanese prisoners who had initially hung back began to engage more actively, encouraged by those who had already overcome their hesitation. Even Lieutenant Saito eventually appeared, ostensibly to check on his men, but soon drawn into watching a particularly competitive chess match. By late afternoon, something remarkable had occurred. The recreation hall had transformed from an American facility that occasionally admitted Japanese prisoners into a genuinely shared space. Laughter crossed language barriers. Gestures and demonstrations replaced words. The simple act of playing together had created a temporary bridge between enemies. "They are still our captors," Corporal Masuda reminded Takeshi as they watched Private Rodriguez bowl a nearly perfect game. "This changes nothing about the war." "Of course," Takeshi agreed quickly. Yet privately he wondered. The experience had changed something. Not about the war, perhaps, but about his perception of the Americans. They were no longer faceless enemies, but individuals with skills, preferences, and personalities. Men who valued recreation as part of a balanced life, even in wartime. This realization was both comforting and deeply troubling. Comforting because it humanized his captivity situation. Troubling because it contradicted the foundational beliefs that had sustained him through training and combat. If the Americans were not the barbaric demons of imperial propaganda, what else might be untrue? The snowstorm day marked a turning point in the camp's social dynamics. The shared experience had broken an invisible barrier, making subsequent interactions less strained. Japanese prisoners who had participated in the tournaments now exchanged nods of recognition with guards they had played against. The recreation hall saw increasing numbers of prisoners during open hours. Camp authorities noted this development with approval. A report filed by Colonel Peterson and later recovered from military archives stated, "The introduction of supervised recreational activities for POWs has notably improved camp morale and reduced disciplinary incidents." Prisoners, initially reluctant, have begun to participate more actively, particularly in bowling, which many have never encountered before. This integration has humanized the guards in their eyes, and vice versa, creating a more manageable environment while maintaining appropriate security protocols. For military psychologists and intelligence officers, this shift represented a strategic success. Every Japanese prisoner who engaged willingly with American recreational activities was one less potential troublemaker, and potentially one more source of intelligence and future goodwill. Yet for the prisoners themselves, the implications were far more personal and profound. Each frame bowled, each game played, subtly undermined the psychological foundation of their military training. They had been taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Yet here were these same Americans, maintaining a highly organized military facility while still carving out time for recreation, and extending that privilege even to enemy prisoners. "Perhaps," ventured Sergeant Tanaka during a late-night barracks conversation, "there is strength in balance that we have not recognized." The statement bordered on heresy. Imperial doctrine emphasized single-minded devotion to duty, with personal comfort and pleasure viewed as distractions. Yet the evidence before them suggested an alternative approach, one in which scheduled recreation might actually enhance rather than diminish military effectiveness. This philosophical reconsideration reached its culmination in late February, when Camp Commander Peterson announced an inter-barracks bowling tournament. Teams would include both guards and prisoners, assigned randomly rather than separated by nationality. Lieutenant Saito immediately objected, arguing that such mingling was inappropriate and potentially compromising for Japanese military personnel. His protests were noted but overruled. "Participation is voluntary," Colonel Peterson responded through interpreters. "Any prisoner who feels it would violate his military oath is free to abstain." The announcement created intense debate among the Japanese prisoners. Some supported Saito's position that participating would dishonor their status of soldiers of the emperor. Others argued pragmatically that refusing would only result in lost privileges and increased tension with the guards. Takeshi found himself torn. The recreational activities had become a bright spot in the monotony of captivity, yet he understood Saito's concern about fraternization with the enemy. In the end, he and approximately 60 other Japanese prisoners decided to participate, while about 40 abstained, maintaining what they considered military propriety. The tournament itself became a watershed moment. Randomly assigned teams meant Japanese prisoners found themselves cheering for American guards and vice versa. The competitive spirit transcended national boundaries, creating temporary alliances based on team assignment rather than military allegiance. Private James Wilson, paired with Takeshi and 3 other Japanese prisoners, emerged as their de facto coach, demonstrating techniques and strategies with infectious enthusiasm. When their team advanced to the final round, the camaraderie had grown so natural that Takeshi found himself high-fiving Wilson after a particularly good frame, a gesture he had learned in the recreation hall and would never have imagined performing with an enemy soldier. "We're actually pretty good together," Wilson remarked through the interpreter as they prepared for the final match. "Funny how that works, isn't it? A few months ago, we were trying to kill each other on some island." The blunt statement caught Takeshi off guard. It was true, of course, yet the current reality, standing side by side in a bowling alley in Wisconsin, seemed surreally disconnected from the blood and horror of the Pacific battlefields. Their team ultimately placed second in the tournament, defeated by a team led by Sergeant Miller, the camp's most skilled bowler. As trophies were distributed, small wooden pins mounted on bases, Colonel Peterson addressed the gathered participants. "This tournament has demonstrated something important," he said, the interpreters carefully translating his words. "Despite the circumstances that brought us together, despite our different languages and customs, we can find common ground in simple human activities. Remember this when you return to your homes someday." The message was simultaneously hopeful and subversive. It acknowledged the temporary nature of their captivity while suggesting that the shared experiences might have lasting impact, that enemies could recognize each other's humanity through something as seemingly trivial as a bowling tournament. For many Japanese prisoners, including Takeshi, this moment crystallized the profound psychological reorientation they had undergone. They had arrived expecting the worst of American captivity based on imperial propaganda. Instead, they had found a system that not only provided for basic needs, but incorporated recreation as an essential component of human welfare, even for prisoners of war. This discovery forced them to question not just their preconceptions about Americans, but the fundamental values of the military culture that had shaped them. If the Americans could be both effective warriors and balanced human beings who valued leisure, perhaps the Japanese military's emphasis on absolute sacrifice and denial of comfort was not the only path to strength. In the months and years that followed, as the war drew to its devastating conclusion, the bowling alley at Camp McCoy remained a symbol of this alternative vision. A physical space where enemies became temporary teammates, where play coexisted with discipline, where humanity persisted even in the shadow of global conflict. After the war, many former prisoners carried these experiences back to a Japan struggling to rebuild from the ashes of defeat. The lessons learned in American camps, including the value of balanced recreation, quietly influenced the reconstruction of Japanese society. Companies gradually incorporated recreational facilities for workers. Schools introduced more robust physical education programs. The rigid pre-war separation between duty and pleasure slowly gave way to a more integrated approach to human well-being. Takeshi Yamamoto, returning to Yokohama in late 1945, found a city devastated by American bombs. Yet amid the destruction, he carried something unexpected from his captivity. Not bitterness or trauma, but a transformed understanding of strength and resilience. The Americans' bowling alley had revealed that true power might lie not in relentless sacrifice, but in sustainable balance. Not in dehumanizing the enemy, but in recognizing shared humanity even across battle lines. Decades later, when bowling alleys began appearing in Japanese cities as part of the post-war American cultural influence, Takeshi watched with a unique perspective. For most Japanese, these facilities represented exotic American entertainment. For him, they echoed with memories of that Wisconsin winter when enemies had momentarily set aside their differences over the crash of falling pins, discovering in simple play the common humanity that war had obscured. In these small human connections, a shared game, a moment of sportsmanship, a recognition of the other's skill and personality, perhaps lay the fragile foundations for understanding that might, with time and nurturing, grow into something stronger than the forces that divide us.